In 1916, at the height of World War I, the U.S. started its next class of battleship, the 32,300-ton Tennessee class. As to be expected, these ships were an incremental improvement on the previous class. First, while carrying the same 14-inch 50-caliber guns as the previous New Mexico class, their guns could elevate to 30 degrees from the start. This gave them a longer range, which necessitated a larger superstructure and higher masts. I wasn't going to do anything with the cage masts because they were mostly gone by World War II, but since we're here. Let's be honest, they were ugly. Hideous, in fact. That being said, aesthetics wasn't the Navy's priority, functionality was. The idea of the cage masts was to get gunnery spotters as high as reasonable to see their target as far away as possible. Range finding was accomplished by having two masts of equal height from the water, the angle of spotting from each allowing the calculation of range. The cage masts themselves were lighter than tripod masts and thought to be durable due to having more redundant parts and the whole structure being more flexible. It was hoped this flexibility would allow it to absorb the shock of the main guns firing, any hits, and high winds. Then along came reality and ruined the whole thing. In high winds, like you get at sea, they were an aerodynamic drag and had a tendency to hum or whistle. Worse yet, because they were made to be flexible to absorb shock, the crew in them tended to get shaken around, badly affecting their ability to accurately hold a target. Finally, while they were surprisingly durable, if one did collapse, say in a storm, its many pieces parts were an utter mess to clean up. The beginning of the end for the cage mast came in the mid-20s when aircraft fitted with radios started taking over the role of long-range gunnery spotting. As battleships went in for modernization, the cage masts were replaced with lower but stronger tripod masts. Radar eventually rendered the whole thing superfluous. Secondary armament was also revised. While originally designed to carry hull-mounted casemates just below the main deck, these were eliminated early enough during construction that the hull could be finished without the characteristic knuckle. The next major change was in the engine room. From the start, these ships had the engineering spaces laid out to take full advantage of the subdivision enabled by the turbo-electric drive. Previous battleships had 8 main engineering rooms, from front to back, 3 boiler rooms, followed by an auxiliary engine room, all seated end to end. Behind them were the 4 turbine rooms, seated side by side, which drove the propellers. With the adoption of turbo-electric drive, which used smaller parts, engineering was now divided into 15 main compartments. In the middle were the 2 turbine rooms, seated end to end. Lining the 2 sides of these were the 8 boilers, 4 on each side, each in their own compartment. This increased division of the boilers naturally led to the adoption of a second funnel. Behind these was the main control room, where electric flow was handled. Finally, behind this, each propeller motor was in its own compartment. There were other parts, like the condenser, which churned used steam to water and sent it back to the boilers, but you get the idea. This was an unprecedented level of subdivision, which translated into a better control of flooding in the ship's vitals. Also, because it took up less width, it allowed the fitting of an improved TDS. The new TDS, or Torpedo Defense System, was the final major change. Whereas previous ships had a 3-layered system of space, liquid, space, the Tennessees took this one better. They used a 5-layer system of an empty space, a liquid layer, another liquid layer, another liquid layer, and an empty space. The total depth here being just over 17 feet. Behind these was the holding wall. Tests had shown that the more rigid the holding wall was, the more likely it was to break. What was actually needed was one that could flex to absorb whatever blast shock made it through the TDS. As with the all-or-nothing armor scheme, it would be easy to assume this comprehensive TDS was the result of hard-won first-hand experience during World War I, where mines and torpedoes nearly tipped the balance of the war. In reality, like all-or-nothing armor, the U.S. essentially figured this all out before the war, putting them well ahead of everyone else in terms of survivability of their battleships. It was a lead the U.S. would never surrender. Tennessee was started May 14, 1917, and finished June 3, 1920. California was started October 25, 1916, and finished August 10, 1921. Main armament was 12 14-inch 50 caliber guns in 4 triple turrets. Again, these were repeats of the guns in the New Mexico class, except that they could elevate to 30 degrees from the start. Again, during World War II, they mostly carried 3/4 high capacity and 1/4 armor-piercing rounds. Secondary armament was also a repeat of the New Mexico class, except for the addition of directors. 14 of the standard 5-inch 51 caliber guns. 10 in superstructure mounted casemates just above the main deck, 5 on each side. The other 4 were just above the casemates in single open mounts, 2 on each side. Turretary armament was 4 3-inch 50 caliber anti-aircraft guns in single open mounts, 2 on each side. Finally, 2 21-inch torpedo tubes were fitted. Propulsion was provided by 8 boilers venting to 2 funnels. These provided steam to run the turbines which powered the motors to generate 26,800 horsepower on 4 shafts for a top speed of 21 knots. Armor was a continued evolution on the previous class. Side armor was 13.5 inches, stretching from turret 1 to turret 4, reducing down to 8 inches below the waterline as it neared the bottom and merged with the TDS. Deck armor was a combined 3.5 inches over the ship's vitals. Barbette armor was up to 13 inches. Turret armor was 18 inches on the front and 5 inches on the roof and sides. 13-inch bulkheads closed off the ends of the armored box. Conning tower armor was 16 inches on the sides and 4 inches on the roof. Already having 30-degree maximum elevation for their guns and a superlative TDS, modifications to this class between the wars was relatively light. With the treaties halting construction of new ships, understandably, the focus was on getting the most out of older vessels and new constructions. By the time their turn came in the mid-30s, tensions in Europe and Asia were already gathering, so they were too badly needed to be spared a lengthy modernization which would take them out of service for a couple years. In 1922, the rear open-mount 5-inch 51 caliber guns on each side was removed, and 4 more 3-inch 50 caliber anti-aircraft guns were fitted, bringing the total up to 4 on each side. In 1924, catapults were added to turret 3 and at the stern of the main deck. In 1929, the 3-inch guns were replaced by the new 5-inch 25 caliber anti-aircraft gun. Again, 4 on each side. In 1941, the remaining open-mount 5-inch 51 caliber guns were removed in preparation for adding 4 of the 1.1-inch medium anti-aircraft gun. When these weren't available, 4 3-inch 50 caliber guns were fitted in lieu. In early 1942, while repairing the minor damage she suffered at Pearl Harbor, Tennessee received a quick modernization. The rear cage mast was removed and replaced with a short tower. The torpedo tubes were also removed. Splinter shields were added to the 5-inch 25 caliber guns. The catapult on turret 3 was removed and radar was fitted. Finally, the hull was bulged to increase the depth of the TDS and restore lost buoyancy. Between September 1942 and May 1943, or June 1942 through January 1944 in California's case, these ships went in for major modernization. The superstructure was replaced with a new one that had a cruiser-type conning tower and only one funnel. All of the old 5-inch 25 caliber and 5-inch 51 caliber guns were removed and replaced with 16 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns in 8 twin turrets, 4 on each side. Light and medium anti-aircraft was updated and increased. New search and fire control radar was fitted. The torpedo tubes were removed from California. Deck armor was increased to 5.5 inches. Armor on the roofs of the turrets was increased to 7 inches. The hull also received massive bulges, significantly increasing the depth of their TDS and restoring lost buoyancy due to weight additions. These bulges, though, did make them too wide to use the Panama Canal and reduce their speed to just under 20 knots. Much work was also done internally, especially to California, which had been sunk and as such had massive water damage. They emerged as virtually brand new ships, being almost totally rebuilt, and weight raised to nearly 34,860 tons. Both were at Pearl Harbor on December 7th. Tennessee was inboard of West Virginia and as such was immune to torpedo attack. Aside from fires and strafing, she only received 2 bomb hits. One hit square on the roof of Turret 3 but failed to penetrate. The second hit the middle barrel of Turret 2 and destroyed it. The damage was relatively minor. California wasn't as lucky. Moored by herself and opened up for inspection the next day, including opening of the double bottom, she was a sitting duck. One bomb exploded on the armored deck, starting fires which eventually filled the engine rooms with smoke. 2 torpedoes hit the ship on the same side at either ends of the engine room. The good news is the TDS wasn't breached, preventing flooding into the ship's vitals and proving its worth. Her open state, however, did allow water to spread through the outer hull rapidly, giving her a pronounced list. A near miss by a bomb near the bow acted like a torpedo hit, and water began flooding in unchecked because of the ship's opened-up condition. Having already seen Oklahoma capsize, West Virginia sink, Arizona explode, smoke filling the ship, the attack still going on, and burning fuel oil heading their way, the crew decided to abandon ship rather than risk life and limb trying to contain the flooding and save the vessel. By the time the ship was reboarded, unchecked flooding had proceeded too far, and 3 days after the attack she sunk into the mud. She was finally refloated in late March and headed to the west coast under her own power the day after the Battle of Midway. Repairs and reconstruction would keep her out until the start of 1944. Tennessee sailed for the west coast and repairs within weeks and spent most of 1942 operating along the west coast with the other slow battleships until going in for reconstruction in August. Returning in May 1943, she headed north and supported the liberation of Kiska in August. She then joined the fleet in supporting the invasion of the Gilberts for the rest of the year. In January and February 1944, she covered the invasion of the Marshalls before moving on to New Ireland in March. In June 1944, both ships covered the invasion of the Marianas, where both were hit by shore fire causing light damage. In the third quarter of 1944, Tennessee covered the invasion of Peleliu, while California went in for repairs sustained when the two collided in mid-August. Both ships then covered the liberation of Leyte, where both took part in the Battle of Surigao Strait, Tennessee firing 69 times and California 63. Tennessee then went in for a refit, while California spent the rest of the year and January 1945 covering the liberation of the northern Philippines. While doing so, on January 6, 1945, she was hit by a kamikaze. In early February 1945, California headed in for repairs even as Tennessee returned to cover the invasion of Iwo Jima. Following this, Tennessee moved on to cover the invasion of Okinawa. While doing so, on April 12th, she was hit by a kamikaze. The damage was light though, and she fought on till the end of the month before leaving for repairs. Both returned in mid-June to close out the battle. Afterward, they covered the minesweeping operation in the South China Sea for the rest of the war. Both were finally sold for scrap in mid-1959 after spending 12 years in reserve.